So I was making a remix the other day and I was going through my plugins and I realized there's a whole load of plugins in there that I just don't use. Either trial versions of stuff that I've tried out and don't like, or even paid plugins that I bought with my own money and just they never really did the job for me. I couldn't get out of them what I wanted to. So I thought, well, I'm going to go through and have a right clear out, get rid of all the ones that I know I'm never going to use, and I've just kept the ones that I know that I use already or I plan on using in the future. And I thought, well, why don't I make a video on it? Why don't I show you the plugins that I actually use? So this is my cleaned up list of plugins within Ableton, and usually I use audio units rather than VSTs. I'm not quite sure why. I think because they're first on the list, that's usually why I go straight for audio units. And to be honest, they always work okay for me. I think for this video, we'll just go through in alphabetical order, just from the top to the bottom. I'll just show you all these different plugins that I use. So the first one is by 29 Palms called Levels. Now this is great on your master channel because this really gives you a good representation of just how loud your track is and also different elements of it. So for example, it can check on the headroom, it can check on the stereo field, dynamic range, and the bass space. Now the bass space basically allows you to mute the kick and bass and see how much bass is within the rest of the track. So it basically warns you if you have something within the rest of your track that is a bit too bassy, that might be kind of conflicting with the kick and bass. So it's kind of useful. It's one of those things that you probably could do without this tool, but to be honest, I find it really, really useful. Now the headroom is probably one of the best things of this tool, this plugin, because as well as actually measuring it out in decibels, it also measures it in lufs as well. Now I'm not going to get into what these are in this video because mainly I probably couldn't give you a scientific explanation, but this plugin is great for giving you those levels, and they basically allow you to kind of match your track up and get it as loud as it needs to be without being too much, too compressed, too squashed or whatever. Now it also has within here a whole load of different settings, so you can actually put the preset on here for what you want the output to be. So say for example, if you're producing a track and you know it's going to be played in the club, then it'll actually set the volume levels, the LUF levels, and the peak threshold to be a certain level ready for the club. But maybe you might be uploading for iTunes or SoundCloud, for example. You can then click on these different presets and it will take these thresholds down or up so that you actually are reaching the level that you want to for the service that you're mastering for. Now, I don't tend to do too much mastering myself, but it's quite useful when I'm kind of putting together a track and I know it's going to be a preview on SoundCloud, that I can actually make sure that the levels are right for SoundCloud. But if I know that I'm playing it in a club, then I can whack it on the club preset and I know what kind of levels I'm going for. So if I play this track back, we can actually see kind of what it does. I've already got Ozone 8 here on the master channel, so that's kind of maximizing the level of this track. This is just a new remix of mine. So you can see within here, as I'm kind of adjusting the maximizer within Ozone, so the limiter within Ozone, I'm increasing the volume and I can see the representation here on this kind of headroom area. So I can switch between the lufs and the decibel meter to kind of see how loud it is. But I can also see the stereo field as well. One of my favorite features of this is enabling the low pass on the stereo field as well. You really want your kind of lows to be mainly in mono, because if you have them in stereo or they're too wide, then it does tend to cause some issues with the mix. So by turning this low pass filter within the stereo field, it just allows you to kind of see just how wide that low end is. So that's kind of cool. And the dynamic range, I think you can probably hear when your track's too compressed, but it does kind of give you this kind of representation here as well. So like the name suggests, it just is really good at monitoring those levels of your track. That's why I tend to use it quite a bit when I'm kind of mastering myself, just so I know what kind of level I'm going for. So next up we have ADSR Sample Manager. Now I don't tend to use this all that much. Every now and again I will come back to this and try it out. I kind of wait for new updates to come through and then I usually try it out again because it can be a little bit buggy. Basically this sample manager allows you to manage all the samples on your hard drive and it will go through and it will analyze them in a whole load of different ways. For example, it will tag them up with different things that it think it is. So it will go through your hard drive and it might find hi-hats, for example, and long hi-hats at that. So it's really kind of useful for automatically going through your hard drive and figuring out what different things are, and then you can then filter your samples, on your hard drive. But also it has a way of playing any sample as well. So for example, I can actually load a sample into here and then play it via MIDI. So as well as being a library manager, it also allows you to actually be a sampler as well. So it can play samples as well. It's kind of useful. As I say, every now and again I will come back to this and I will try it out, but it doesn't always work for me and sometimes it can be a little bit buggy, so I don't tend to use it all that much. So every now and again I will try it out when there's a new update that comes along. Next up we have a few plugins by Air. Now I tend to use these quite a bit. The first one on the list is the DB33. Now this is an organ plugin and it's my go-to organ plugin, to be honest. It's got a really nice sound with some great presets in it. It sounds super nice when you start playing chords with this. For example, a minor 11th can sound really nice coming through this. Plus you can go through and tweak all of the different settings as well. I really love this for its sound. I use it in a lot of my tracks. If you hear an organ, it's most probably this one. Next up, also by Air, is Velvet. I love Velvet and it is my go-to Rhodes. It has such a nice sound out of it. And in fact, we have a whole load of different types of Rhodes as well. We've got the Mark 1, Mark 2, SC73, A200 and the Planet. Now I tend to use the Mark 2 quite a bit. And it's got such a nice sound from it. When you team it up with some nice chords, it just sounds great. Again, you've got a whole load of great controls on it, and depending on the velocity that you input, you have some really nice, interesting sounds. It's also got a whole load of great inbuilt effects, sometimes which I use, most of the time I turn them off, but it does have some nice effects within here that you can go straight for a preset, and usually they work really, really nicely. So next up is a plugin that is actually built into Ableton 10 now. So why is this still on my list? Why have I kept it? Well, the Glue by Cytomic is a plugin that I've been using for years. I've been using it on my master channel or on my drums bus to glue everything together. And the reason I've actually kept this plugin on its own rather than actually using the Ableton version is it actually has some really great presets. I tend to use these presets all the time. For example, under the drum one, we have a whole load of different options within here for parallel compression with it. We got different rooms here which work really nicely. For example, I tend to use the New York settings within here on my drums bus. That works really nicely. And then also the mastering presets are really good as well. The Glue and the Glue 2 I've been using for years. These presets just do what you need them to do straight out the box, which is why I've kept this plugin installed, which is why I use this version rather than the Ableton one. I don't think there's actually any difference between the two. I just tend to have all my presets within here, so that's why I'm using this one. Plus, I really quite like the interface as well. I think it looks quite cool. So next up, we've got a couple of plugins by D16. The first is Decimort, and this is a bit crusher, and I tend to use this quite a bit on my drums. As we can see here, I've got my tops group here, and I've got Decimort as the first thing within here, because I like to kind of put everything through here. So all the different drums, I really like to kind of crush them up. And there are some really great presets within here. If I solo this and turn Decimort off, you'll hear what it sounds like with it off and then with it on. I just love how gritty and kind of rough this really makes the sounds. And going through these presets, there's some really kind of gnarly one as well. If you want to kind of get really kind of rough and distorted, there's some really good presets within here. You can even see under the presets, there are different levels of distortion from the subtle through to the strong. But of course, you can take any of these presets and then start tweaking them however you want to. So I tend to use the dry wet when I'm putting in one of these presets. So I'll work with the wet signal first and then just gradually mix it into the dry signal. So I've kind of got this parallel bit crushing going on. So I'm kind of using some of the distorted signal and some of the original signal as well. So I'm kind of, yeah, that's how I kind of dirty up my drums a little bit. So next up is Punchbox, also from D16, and this is actually a kick synth. So this allows you to create your own kicks. Now they've got a whole load of great presets already within this, and I've only used this a couple of times so far, but I'm really happy with the result that comes out of it, because it really allows you to get in there and tweak every part of the kick. So you can separate the subbiness from the click and kind of adjust each part of that. Then you've also got the distortion on there, bit crusher, filter. There's a whole load of different things on here built into this plugin that really allow you to kind of craft that kick to be exactly how you want to. And it's got some really great presets in here, some really kind of extreme stuff, but also some really tweakable stuff as well. And you can take any one of these and kind of tweak all the different settings of it. So you can make that kick shorter, for example. There's just so many possibilities with this synth that I really look forward to kind of playing with it a bit more. I'm going to go through at some point and go through trying to find the presets that I really like, and then maybe tweaking them for how I want them to be within my tracks. So yeah, it's definitely going to be one of those things I'm going to be using a lot in the future. Next up is Bass Engine by DopeVST. Now this is one of my go-to bass instruments, if you like, and it is actually designed as a hip-hop bass, but because of the kind of house music that I produce, I use a lot of hip-hop kind of sounds, so this kind of works really nicely, and it's got some great presets. Again, I like to kind of go through some of these presets and use these. You can see there's just so many built into here that you could really spend a whole while going through. Now these are all sampled bass, so it does take a couple of seconds just to load all the samples in, but you get some really nice sounds out of this. Now, I can't say that I use every single preset within here, but some of these work quite nicely when layered with other basses as well. For example, that last patch, I might use just the top end of and then layer it with another bass, maybe a sub bass of some sort. But it's great to go through these presets and you can really get inspired by some of the sounds that are within here. Now, the controls to actually tweak it aren't that great, mainly because it is a rompler, so it's just sampled basses. So there's only so much control over that, but you don't really need too much more. And to be honest, I like the kind of strip back of all the controls within here because it just allows me to find the sound that I want to and then go ahead with writing the rest of the track. Next up, we have some plugins by Electron. Now, I actually have the Analog 4, which is actually a hardware saturator. And I actually use that on my master channel, but I don't actually use the plugin. The plugin is when you actually interface the Analog 4 via USB. So you plug it in via USB and it's all sent through the plugin. However, I found that to be a little bit buggy and it doesn't work so great for me. So on my master channel, I actually have an external audio effect, an Ableton external audio effect, which actually sends the audio out of the master channel into the analog heat and then back from the analog heat into my sound card and back into the master channel again. So everything is routed through the analog heat via analog. So I don't actually use the plugins within here. Now, the plugins within here are great for managing the presets. So if you actually plug in the analog heat via USB, you can actually manage all the presets. So I do tend to use that occasionally when I want to clean up any of the presets, but generally I don't really use that plugin so much. Next up, we have the UltraChannel by Eventide. Now, I haven't actually used this, or I don't think I've actually used this before. At some point, I did get it. I think it was maybe a freebie or cert. I'm not even quite sure how I came about this plugin, but it's something that I've actually left within my plugin list because I want to try it out and I want to see what I can get out of it. It seems to be a channel strip that will go on any one of your tracks. So it actually includes a whole load of things. So you've got a gate, a compressor, you've got an EQ on there, you've got a pitch shift in there as well, and stereo delays. So it does sound quite interesting. I especially want to play around with the stereo delays on here. So that's why I've kind of left it in the list. I'm actually going to play around with this and kind of see what I can get out of it and see if it's going to be useful in my workflow. So that's why I've kind of kept it on the list, but to be honest, I don't know what it does at the moment, so I haven't really played around with it. Next up, we have a whole load of plugins by IK Multimedia. Now, I used to use T-Rax quite a bit. Before I started using Ozone for my mastering, I was using T-Rax or Trax. I'm not even quite sure how you're supposed to pronounce that, but basically T-Rax is a suite of mastering tools, pretty much like Ozone is. So you can actually load any of their presets, for example, and it will load a whole load of different modules within here that you can turn on and off and play around with to kind of master your track. Now, this plugin used to be quite famous for a certain preset that it had within here. So under the deluxe section within here, if I scroll down just a little bit, we have the super loud preset. Now, this is kind of famous because it really just made your tracks huge. Basically, it had this big kind of brick wall limiter on it, which really just it just made your track sound huge, and everybody was using this for quite a bit of time. I kind of moved on from this onto Ozone, but also I was getting somebody else to master my tracks as well, so my emphasis wasn't so much on making something super loud. It was just about mastering something that was good enough to play in the club. And to be honest, this was a very kind of, I wouldn't say crude way of doing it, but it distorted your track quite a bit. It made it a bit too much. I think this was when the kind of loudness wars were around and you really wanted to make your track as loud as possible. So yeah, this was kind of famous for doing that. And I don't tend to use that very much anymore. So I just tend to use Ozone instead. Now, it also includes a whole load of plugins within here. So I bought the suite of this. So all of these are individual plugins that you can actually chuck on your track. And I've actually kept it within here because I have a few tracks, older tracks that still use T-Rax. So I've kind of kept this within here just in case. But also, I actually want to go through a few of these and maybe see if I can use some of these individually. Maybe there's a certain few within here that might work quite nicely on individual tracks, or maybe even on their own on the master channel. So that's why I've kind of kept them in there. Okay, so let's move on to Izotope. Now, this is a massive folder on my hard drive, mainly because I just love some of the plugins that Izotope produce. And I've got a whole load of different versions on here. For example, I've got Ozone 7 within here, and I've also got Ozone 8 down the bottom. I've got all 3 versions of Neutron as well, Neutron 1, 2 and 3, and I just love using these. Now, I've done videos on both of these. They're both on my channel if you want to check them out, so I'm not going to go into them too much. Basically, Ozone 8 is the mastering suite that I tend to use for mastering my own tracks. Now, I do tend to send my tracks out to an external, a third-party mastering engineer to get them done for when I release my tracks. But when I first finish a track and I want to play it in the club in my DJ sets, then I'll master it myself through Ozone 8. Now, it does have the master assistant, which really helps. You pick a reference track and you can kind of match the loudness and all the different kind of dynamics to that reference track. It's not perfect. It is, of course, something that gives you a good starting point. So when you go through the master assistant, it listens to your track and makes the tweaks that it thinks it should do. And then you can go through after that and make the tweaks that you want to. So say, for example, it might be a little bit too much on the maximizer, which is their limiter. So you might want to back off that a little bit. Or maybe the EQ is it's pumped some highs up that you don't want pumped up. Maybe you want a certain type of sound. So you can go through and you can tweak it afterwards. But yeah, I kind of use Ozone 8 as my kind of mastering suite. That's generally what I kind of use. And I've actually gone through that on a separate video. Next up is Neutron 3. I love Neutron 3 as well. You tend to drop this onto a channel, so say for example a piano, and again you can use the mix assistant within here to listen to the track and it'll actually make adjustments to that track to make it sound better. Now this is all kind of AI kind of stuff. It's listening to your track and it's making some suggestions as to what it can do to make it sound better. Doesn't always get it right and sometimes you have to tweak it. Now I've used Neutron 3 on the bass within this remix. So if I open this up, you can see all the different things that I've done with it. So it's got the sculptor in here, which is put to about 70%. The sculptor, as far as I can make out, kind of accentuates certain parts of an instrument, and it has a whole load of presets here where it kind of, I don't know, it's got almost like presets of EQ maybe, or saturation or something that kind of accentuates certain parts of a sound. So from this bass patch, it's putting in about 70% of this sculptor. I don't really know what's going on within here, but sometimes it works quite nicely, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I'm disabling this module, so I can actually turn this module off, and sometimes I will leave it on. Next up is the EQ, and this is one of my favorite things that the mix assistant does. It will listen to that track that you put it on and it will make suggestions to the EQ that might improve the sound. Now this isn't always the case, but it's a good starting point. So it might make a cut, for example, like this, or it might make a boost like this. It actually does all of this automatically, and then you can go through, and if you don't like it, you can actually tweak it, you can move it around. Of course, you can do whatever you want with it. You're not kind of stuck with it. It's just one of those things. And then you've also got a whole load of other modules on here, like the exciter and a couple of compressors. I don't tend to use the exciter that much. It tends to ruin the sound for me. I never kind of like the results that it has, so that's why I've disabled it for this sound. But you can go through and you can play around with this and really come up with some nice, interesting results and fix some of the issues that are within here. And one final feature I do want to mention, which I've done in a previous video, but I'm going to mention it again. If you actually have the Neutron on 2 different channels, you can use masking, which actually allows you to overlay one of the EQ from one channel with another one, so you can actually see where certain things are overlapping and maybe conflicting. It's a really kind of cool feature, and definitely check out my video that I did on it to see how all that works. Next up, we have the Korg M1, and this is just an essential for any dance music producer that wants to produce kind of classic dance music. It's one of those keyboards that was used for just about everything in the 90s. All those kind of big piano lines, the organs. It's just got some really kind of classic sounds in it. For example, the M1 organ is just a classic sound found in 90s house music. And it also has some amazing piano presets as well. It's just one of those plugins that I couldn't be without, and I reach for with pretty much every single track that I do. It's got those classic sounds and they just seem to work. Next up is an interesting little EQ that I picked up as a free download. It's called the Luftikus by IKJB, and it's a really kind of stripped back EQ that is quite interesting to use every now and again. It's got very limited controls. It's not like a parametric EQ that you'd usually be used to, like the EQ8 within Ableton, but it has some interesting frequencies that it can really pick out some good parts of your track. I tend to use this sometimes on the drums and sometimes on pianos. Every now and again, I'll kind of tweak these individual frequencies, and sometimes it will help, sometimes it won't. It's one of those things that I reached for every now and again, and it's just a free plugin, so I kind of just try it out on various different things. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Next up is the Loop Masters folder. Now, I did have Loop Cloud for quite a bit, but recently I kind of stopped the subscription because I like Splice more, to be honest. I like the catalog within Splice, but there's no denying that the actual Loop Cloud plugin is a great plugin, and probably in the future maybe I will have that subscription again. I'm not quite sure. I've just kind of kept it there just in case that maybe one day I might not be inspired by Splice sounds. I might want to go back to Loop Cloud. So that's why I've kept it in there. And also I've got the Bassmaster. This is another plugin that they've produced that I've actually got on trial at the moment. I think the trial might have actually passed. But yes, it has expired. So it's one of those plugins that I've been meaning to kind of get and play around with. I think I installed the demo once and I played around with it for maybe 10, 15 minutes, but then I didn't really have much time to kind of work at it anymore. And since then, obviously the demo has expired. But at some point I probably will check that plugin out and give it a proper go, because I think it might be a really good one to kind of work with. Next up is a whole load of plugins by Mixed In Key. Now, Mixed In Key is kind of well known for its key detection software, but they launched a whole load of different plugins recently that allow you to come up with some MIDI ideas. So there's chords, deep, melody, and play. 4 different plugins for kind of coming up with different MIDI notes, basically. Now, I haven't really played around with these much. I bought them because I thought, well, it might be interesting to try out, but to be honest, I haven't even jumped into them. They've been sitting on my hard drive. I've been meaning to play around with it, but I haven't got into it at all. So that's something that I've kind of kept in there, and I'm going to go through them at some point. Maybe I might make a video on a few of them, the ones that are useful to me. Next up is Native Instruments Massive. Now, I used to use this quite a bit, mainly for bass sounds and occasionally for stabs or pads. But as my kind of sound has got a little bit more kind of organic, a bit more soulful, I'm using this less and less. It's still an amazing synth to use, and it's just got so many features within here that occasionally I will just kind of reach for it, maybe to make a certain kind of effect or something, or maybe a certain kind of sound when I want to kind of craft something from scratch. It's just very I find it really kind of easy to kind of go through and make patches from scratch with Massive. I don't know why. I think it's just one of those interfaces that just works for me. Next up is a plugin that I installed only a little while ago. It's a free download from noisemakers called Siren, and it's actually a dub siren, and it makes a really kind of interesting effect. It's one of those things that's really kind of hard to describe, so I'm actually just going to play it for you so you can hear how it sounds. It's a really fun plugin to play around with, and I used it on a remix recently because I was looking for a lead line that was more like an effect. So I wanted something that was like a siren-y kind of sound, but also a bit more like a lead. And I found this little freeware download, and honestly, it was just so much fun to play around with. So yeah, I definitely recommend downloading this one because it is a free download and it's just fun to play around with. Next up is a plugin by Plugin Boutique called Big Kick. Now, this is another kick synthesizer, and I've used it on a few tracks in the past. That's why I've kept it within this list. But I'm actually going to start using Punchbox now, so I'm probably not going to use this going forward. It does have some really great features. Again, it allows you to separate the click from the kind of body, the boom of the kick. So you can actually go through and really tweak a kick to be how you want it to be. And in some ways, this is a lot more kind of simplified and a lot easier to kind of use. But I just love some of the filters, some of the distortion within Punchbox, which is why I'm probably going to be using that one going forward. Now, I've got a couple of plugins here that I've actually installed because I was doing a few collabs with a few different people and they were using Vintage Warmer. Now, it's not something that I'd normally use, so I've actually got it as a demo just so I could kind of hear how it sounded and then kind of work on them with this collab. So it's not actually a registered version. I'm not quite sure whether I'm actually going to register it because it's not something I tend to use. I will use the analog heat if I'm going to kind of saturate something. So I'm probably not going to use that. So yeah, it's one of those things that I've kept in the list because I tend to do collabs and a lot of people tend to use that. Next up, we have the Roland Cloud section. Now, Roland released their kind of subscription model, their cloud service, which allows you to pay a certain amount per month and have access to all of their different synths. Now, I did try this out for a little bit and I've kind of gone away and come back to it and gone away and come back to it. So I think I've actually stopped it at the moment, but I might go back to it a bit later. It's one of those things that I kind of reach for every now and again, but then I realized that I like certain other synths more. So I've kind of used these ones in a few different tracks, so that's why they're still in here in the list. That's why I haven't deleted them out of here just yet. But it's one of those things that I don't tend to use all that much and I might not be using going forward. So I might jump into it again. They've got some really great synths in there, but at the moment I'm not actually using those. They're just in there just in case I need to go back to those projects. Next up, we got a great little plugin from Sample Magic called Magic AB. Now, this is something that you load onto your master channel and it allows you to listen between your current track and up to 9 other tracks. So you can actually go between your track and another track and use it as reference. So you can kind of switch between the two. So it's a really kind of good way to kind of see if your track is on par with another track. So you could load another track within here, for example, and then go between the two, your track and then that track. Now, I don't tend to use this anymore because I actually use the feature within Ozone because Ozone's got that built in, that whole reference feature. So I tend to just use that because I always have that on the master channel anyway. So it doesn't make too much sense having the Magic AB anymore. But again, it's something I've had in previous projects. So I've just kind of left it within there. And who knows, I might want to just use it in the future. Next up is the Sonic Academy section. Now this includes 2 plugins, the Ana Synth and the Kick Synth. The Ana Synth is actually a really great synthesizer. It's got so many functions built into it. It's a really complex synth. It's one of those things you can spend a while working with. There's some really great presets that you can get from Sonic Academy as well. Some of them are really great. And I've actually gone through and I've made a few different presets myself whenever I've done any courses for Sonic Academy. If you want to head over to sonicacademy.com, you'll see that I've done 6 courses for them, and in every single one of them I've used the Ana Synth. It's a really great synth for providing those different sounds, and I've always found it quite easy to use within my tracks. I don't tend to use synthesis too much. As I say, I use things like the bass engine for my basses because I kind of like that sampled sound, but when I do need to synthesize something, then the Ana is a really good option. That's why I've still got it on my hard drive and I turn to it quite occasionally. Next up, we have Kick 2. This is another kick synthesizer, this time by Sonic Academy, and this one's actually a really good one. Again, there's a whole load of features within here, and I have used this occasionally. Again, I've used it with the courses that I've done for Sonic Academy, but as I say, I'm using Punchbox going forward, so that's why I'm not using it that much. I do have some old projects where I use Kick 2, so that's why it's still in there, but I'm probably going to be using Punchbox going forward. Next up, we have some plugins by Soundspot. Now, these were a whole load of freebies that I actually got via Plugin Boutique. I haven't actually tried any of these, so I'm not quite sure what most of these do. I'm guessing they're just, well, this one looks like an EQ and some other stuff within here. But as I say, they're all kind of free downloads. Whenever I kind of bought some stuff with Plugin Boutique, I got them as a free download. So I've still got these within here. And I think at some point, I'm probably going to just try these out and see what they do. This looks like some kind of transient shaper, maybe. Who knows? I might just try them out at some point in the studio. That's why they're still in the list, because I want to try them out and see what I can do with them. Then we got Sound Tower. Now, this is actually a plugin to control the Toraz AS1. So I've got the Pioneer Toraz AS1 as my mono synth, which sits on my desktop. It's my hardware synth. Now, this plugin allows me to control all of the different controls on the AS1. Now, the AS1 itself only has a handful of physical controls actually on the hardware itself. So it's really nice to kind of have this plugin here to go through and tweak some of the stuff that is actually hidden away. That's why I've still got it within here, and I use this to tweak some of the presets on the AS1 when I'm using it within my productions. Next up, we have some plugins by TAL. Now, I love the TAL U-No-LX. This is one of my go-to synths. I had it as a freeware version a while ago, but this is the paid version. It's got a few more features within it, a few more things that you can do with it, but I just love some of the sounds that you get out of here. It sounds like a Juno. It's got a really kind of great sound to it, and some of the presets are just so cool. I really, really love using them. It's got such an awesome sound. I just love using it on my tracks. Pretty much every track that I start up these days, I usually jump straight for this, and I kind of compose melodies using this now. And then if I don't quite like the sound, then I might swap it out for something else. But usually I find something that I kind of like within this synth, and it really kind of just, it gives me some great ideas. I've also got the TAL filter in there as well, something that I've downloaded recently that I'm going to be trying out and playing around with, but I haven't really tried that out so far. Next up is another free download, this time from Tokyo Dawn Labs, called the Nova. Now, the reason I've got this EQ is because whenever I've done courses and I've kind of designed them around the fact that you can use any version of Ableton, you don't actually get a parametric EQ within Ableton Live Intro. You only get the EQ3, which doesn't have all the controls on that you really kind of want when you start producing music. So I was actually looking for a freeware version of a parametric EQ, and the Nova seems to fit that bill. It seems to do a really kind of good job. So you can put a high pass filter in here, a low pass filter within here. You've got all the controls to kind of go through here and really tweak this. As I say, for a freeware parametric EQ, I couldn't find anyone that was as fully featured as this one. So yeah, this is one of those things that I do recommend to people. If you have Ableton Live Intro and you're looking for a decent EQ that is free, then yeah, definitely get this one downloaded. Now, the next plugin is a little bit more unusual from the stuff that I'd usually use. The Tyrell N6 has got a really very unique sound. It's kind of got this really, I don't know, 70s, 60s, 70s vibe. It's got some really interesting sounds that come out of it. Just some of these presets just sound a bit weird, but every now and again they might just come in handy. It's a really unusual synth, but it's a free synth. It's great to kind of play around with. It's got some really unique sounds, and I tend to go through the presets and then tweak all of those. Sometimes it's nice to come up with a lead line or a pad or something like that. It's full of great surprises, this synth, and as I say, it's free, so you might as well download it and give it a go. Next up is another free plugin from Voxengo. This one's called Stereo Touch, and this adds a little bit of stereo delay to a track just to make it feel wider. Now, this is one of those things that I've got other plugins that do a better job. So within the Ozone suite, we've got the Ozone Imager, which actually really pushes things out quite wide, but this can often do an interesting job as well. So by just offsetting things, the delay slightly, you can actually really make something quite wide. And as a free download, this works quite nicely as well. So yeah, it's one of those things I definitely recommend giving a go, playing around with it. Next up, we got the Waves section. Now, Waves is obviously a really famous maker of plugins, and they make audio effects, they make instruments, and I've got a whole load of these plugins that I use in different amounts, really. There's some new ones, some old ones. It's actually split across my audio units and my VSTs. All the new ones are all audio units, and my old ones are in the VSTs for some reason, some strange reason. The ones in my audio units are all ones I've downloaded recently, bought recently, and some of them I'm just kind of playing around with. For example, the J37 is one that I actually purchased and downloaded the other day. It's actually a tape saturator, and it can do some interesting things. I've only kind of played around with it a little bit. It's one of those things I've got to kind of figure out how I'm going to use it, but I know that a lot of producers use this, and it has some really nice effects to it. Plus, it looks like a great plugin, doesn't it? The interface is awesome. So maybe it's one of these things I might put on the drum bus, for example. I don't know. I don't know how I'm going to use this yet, but I know that a lot of people use it and it's supposed to be really good. So I thought, well, it's in the sale. I thought I'd pick it up. I've also got a few plugins that I downloaded recently to work on vocals. For example, the Renaissance Vox, the RVox. This is a really kind of basic compressor, but it really kind of makes vocal pop. It works quite well. I read some reviews and I've tested it out on a few tracks and it works really well. I've also got the vocal rider as well, which keeps all the vocal levels right. It kind of rides the volume so that it always keeps them kind of right. It's hard to explain, but it works quite well. And again, it's one of those things I've only used on a few tracks, but it seems to work pretty decently. Under my VSTs, I've also got a whole load of other Waves plugins. So the Abbey Road vinyl I tend to use. I use that quite a bit. Putting that on the master channel just kind of gives it that little bit of saturation. So sometimes when I don't want to use the analog heat, or maybe if I'm on the road and I don't have access to my hardware, then sometimes I will use this. Again, it just adds some saturation to the master channel to make it feel a bit more old school, maybe. I'm not quite sure I suppose the description of what this does, but it adds something to it, just makes it feel a little bit warmer. So that's why I kind of use this. I've also got the bass rider. So the bass rider is very similar to the vocal rider. It will keep the bass notes all at the same level, which is very useful. I've got the CLA vocals, which is actually a suite of plugins. I guess it's a suite of plugins, you could say, almost like an effect rack almost. With a whole load of presets that work really well for vocals. So you can control bass, treble, compression, reverb, delay, and pitch. And you've got these different presets under here. I especially like things like the compressor where the presets are push, spank, and wall. It's just kind of cool. I use it every now and again. It's one of those things where I can put it on a vocal, and sometimes it makes it better, sometimes it doesn't. Next up, I've got Max Volume. I don't think I've actually used that. I think that might have been a freebie that I still haven't tried out yet. The One Knob Louder and Pressure. Again, more freebies, I think, possibly. I might have downloaded them at some point, not quite sure. Renaissance Bass, I tend to use this quite a bit. So I will put this on a bass instrument. It's really kind of simple controls, but I will put this on a sub bass, for example, and this will kind of add some distortion. I think it adds distortion and it makes that bass heard more up the frequency. So rather than it being all subby, it kind of adds some distortion, which then creates some frequencies, a bit further up, which actually means through, not as great speakers, you will hear the bass pop through. That's my kind of real layman's explanation for what this does. But basically, it kind of adds some distortion to your sub bass that'll actually kind of make it pop a bit more on speakers. I've also got the sound shifter as well, the pitch. This allows you to pitch something up and down. I'm not quite sure why I did buy this and download this. Must be a reason before, because usually I just pitch things in Ableton, so I'm not quite sure why I downloaded this or bought this. Next up, we have one of my favorite plugins, probably the one that I use the most. This goes on every single track of mine, the LFO tool. Now this is my kind of shaper, this is my sidechain tool. So you'll see on the bass track here, I've got the LFO installed on here, and this basically just shapes out the volume of the bass as it's being played. So what it is it's ducking the volume. You can see that this is going down to 0 and then coming back up to 100%, and it's kind of ducking the kick. So you can see when I kind of play this back. So it's doing the same thing as sidechain compression would be. It's basically lowering the bass every time the kick hits, although it's not actually taking a frequency from the kick. It's actually just shaping the volume. And the reason I tend to use the LFO tool over using sidechaining compression is because sometimes I don't want to compress something. I don't want to compress the bass. I don't want to add any compression to it. I just want to duck it from the kick. So I tend to use the LFO tool to duck it from the kick and then do my compression separate if I want to, which most of the time I don't tend to do, or I will do maybe through something like Neutron, for example. So yeah, the LFO tool is something that I always use on my bass just to make sure that it really gets out of the way of the kick. And then finally, we got the XLN folder. Now this under here, I've got the RC20 retro color. Now this is something that I've actually been testing. I was testing for a little while, and I think I'm actually going to buy the full version. I actually want to get this. As you can see, my trial has expired, but I'm actually going to be buying this one. I was trying it out recently, and it works really, really nicely. Basically, what this does is it's another kind of saturator, but it's got a whole load of things within it. So you can see, hopefully, just underneath the trial thing here, it's got some wobble in there, it's got some distortion, it's also got some reverb in there, and it's got some really interesting presets that kind of give it some really nice effects. So if you're using it on your drums, if you're using it on vocals, it will give it a certain kind of coloring, which is, you know, what you want if you want to kind of get things to sound a little bit more retro, a little bit more distorted. Yeah, it's a really interesting plugin, and after trialing it, it's one of those things I'm definitely going to get. And actually, you can now get it on Splice Rent to Own as well. So that plugin is a great one if you want to kind of try it out and then you want to own it. Then yeah, the Rent to Own on Splice is a great way of being able to do that. So those are the plugins that made the cut. These are the plugins that I use all the time within my productions, my originals, my remixes, pretty much whatever I do. These are my go-to plugins, but I'm also trying out new plugins all the time. I think it's really important because you never know when a new plugin might come along that can really help the way that you work or improve your sound. So I definitely recommend trying out new plugins. And if you want to try out any of these, I'll put links in the description below to get hold of any of those. And if this video has been useful to you, then definitely subscribe to my channel. I've got a whole load more content like this on my channel, different music production stuff, live performance stuff, basically a whole load of stuff. So definitely check out my channel, subscribe to it, and hit that notification bell so you're notified the moment I upload a brand new video. And hopefully I'll see you again in the next one.